today I want to talk about basically, in a sense, what is going on in the United States. We have Trump, we have impeachment, we have white nationalism. You're probably wondering, like, have they gone crazy? Well, yes, a little bit. Okay, and basically, I want to argue today that part of the cause of what's going on is in response to increasing diversity in the United States of visible minorities. Now, the traditional view of the problems of diversity, going back to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, is that diversity presents a challenge to democracy because of minorities' failures to assimilate, which in turn creates conflict and instability, and in extreme cases demands for separation. Now, I want to make another argument, and I certainly think that the lack of assimilation can be a problem, but I think the main danger to democracy right now comes from the majority, not the minority. In other words, these changes have created a fear of a quote-unquote racial threat, which undermines democracy by promoting polarization and efforts to limit democratic rights, including voting rights, by the white majority aimed at largely the visible minorities. Okay, now to understand what's going on in the United States, we have to reach back into the 19th century and think about where Western democracy came from in the United States. When it was founded, as many of you know, it was founded by racially whites. Native Americans and blacks obviously were deprived of the right to vote. And even after slavery ended, as most of you know, in the South, African Americans were not given the full right to vote until about the 1960s. And as a result, if we look at sort of modern contemporary definitions of democracy, which include things like free and fair elections, as well as the demand that all adults have the right to vote and participate in elections, the United States did not become a full multiracial democracy until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is one thing that's just worth keeping in mind. I think we oftentimes hear that of the United States as being a 200-year-old democracy, which is not completely wrong, that you had competitive elections. But in terms of democracy as we understand it, in which all adults have the right to vote, it's basically when I was born in 1968. That's when the United States became a full democracy as we understand it today. At the same time, in Canada, the United States, you've had, I think, full democracy since the late 60s, but it's been in a period when whites, and I'll talk, that in itself is a created identity, have accounted for the overwhelming portion of the population, such that white dominance has not been effectively threatened. So as late as 1980, 80% of the United States were non-Hispanic whites. This is, however, as some of you probably know, has been changing dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years. Today, non-Hispanic whites, the share has gone down from 80% in 1980 to 60% in 2016. As of 2011, most births are now among non-whites. And European whites, mainly due to sort of birth rates and immigration, are expected to be a minority by 2045. Now, I want to emphasize this is in itself not a problem. However, in the context of the United States, this has created something I call white anxiety. Emerging out of perceived threats to white culture that make many people in the United States quite anxious. There are studies out of NYU which show that simply reading about the racial shift, the shift of racial balance in the census increases hostility among whites towards minorities. There are increasing fears in parts of the United States that, quote unquote, the people in my group are losing jobs to the other group. This white anxiety has also been fostered in Europe by rapid immigration, namely the 2015 refugee crisis, which together with media coverage as sort of portraying immigrants as invaders, increases sort of hostility towards minorities and led to the rise of certain populist parties in Germany and Austria. So this is not simply a phenomenon of the United States. Now, the intensity of this sort of white anxiety is strengthened by something that economist Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky call loss aversion. This is the idea that psychologically people are much more concerned about losing than gaining. So it's, in most people's heads, it's better not to lose $5 than to find $5, even though mathematically they're equivalent. And part of, I think, this sort of sense of loss makes people more anxious and willingness, and increases their willingness to take risks, voting for outsiders, people like Donald Trump and the like. Now, not everyone is susceptible to this sort of notion of white anxiety or racial threat. We find differences in the United States by region as well as by education. Historically, for reasons that are probably clear to many of you, the South, because of the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery, has been most susceptible to this notion of racial threat. And also it's been shown by a number of studies that people with less educated whites tend to also be more concerned about these issues. So the question is, well, how does this racial threat actually threaten democracy? Which I think is what's going on in the United States. I think it does so primarily by increasing polarization of politics that in turn encourages parties to destroy or undermine democratic institutions rather than give the other side power, and two, increases support for anti-democratic measures designed to prevent the other side from gaining power. First of all, this kind of fear of racial threat encourages politicians of certain parties to demonize minorities. Political opponents are not simply viewed as people who support maybe different policies, tax policies, lower tax rate, more funding for school, less funding for school, right? But instead, these opponents are portrayed as a fundamental threat to people's way of life. So loss of power means much more than you don't get your preferred policy. It means it's perceived as a loss of your way of life, right? So if elections represent a fundamental existential threat, then you're very likely to support anti-democratic measures to prevent the opposition from coming to power. So it does two things. It encourages parties to disrupt institutions that they are on the losing end, and encourages support for our extremists or autocrats over their moderates. Now, historically, American politics was not at all polarized. When I was growing up in Ohio in the 1970s, it was considered among the least polarized democracies in the world. Both Democrats and Republicans, the two major parties, had their conservative and liberal wings. In particularly the Democrats, you had sort of the urban liberals and the southern conservatives. And the Republicans similarly had sort of a mix of conservative and liberal wings. This, however, changed dramatically with the American Civil Rights Movement that was aimed against many of the restrictions I just talked about on voting rights in the South. For a variety of reasons, the Democratic Party, which historically supported segregation, chose to back desegregation in the South. And this, in turn, created, the Republican Party, in turn, took advantage of the political opening created by the Democratic Party's support for civil rights to capture support in the South. So when Richard Nixon was elected, the year I was born in 1968, he carried out something called the Southern Strategy, in which he sought to sort of use implicit racism to attract, and notions of states' rights, to attract support from Southern whites. And oftentimes this was in terms of what we call dog whistle racial appeals. These are sort of appeals that on the face of it are not racist, but have a kind of racial content. Examples include things like law and order. So when politicians who historically in the United States talked about law and order, in principle that doesn't seem to have a racial content, but in fact they're talking about sort of, locking up black criminals. Or when Reagan talked about welfare queens, and there was an implicit kind of racial notion that sort of minorities disproportionately benefited from welfare, right? And so a lot of the Republican, so there wasn't sort of explicit racism, it was this sort of dog whistle racial appeals. But this shift gradually kind of increased polarization in the United States because no longer did you have a Democratic Party divided by conservatives and liberals, but you had kind of a realignment where all the conservatives were in the Republican Party and all the liberals were in the Democratic Party. So, by the 1980s, it took a long while for this to kind of play itself out. The Democrats became a party of ethnic minorities and urban white liberals, and the Republicans became primarily a party of conservative rural whites. So one thing I'm going to talk about in a second, the Republican Party has an extraordinarily uniform base, right? They have these whites, whereas the Democrats have to sort of deal with a lot of different constituencies, which makes their challenge very different. Okay, and so this sort of polarization was strengthened by kind of sorting of voters. So increasingly, whether or not you support the Republican or Democratic Party can be predicted by a lot of different things: age, religion, race. So among non-whites, non-whites today account for about 50% of Democratic support and only 5% of Republican support. We also see striking divisions by age. 65 and above, Republicans have a 26-point advantage, and those are their 26% greater support among those older people, whereas in the young, it's the opposite. Ages 18 to 29, the Democrats have a 26-point advantage. The problem for the Democrats is that you guys, the older people, vote, the younger people don't vote. And also we see divisions by region, and with the South supporting Republicans, and the two coasts, New York or California, heavily Democratic. Furthermore, this is important, there have been increasing divisions of education. In 2018, non-college educated whites had 36% more of them supported Republicans than supported Democrats. So you can really see this sort of division into two clear camps. Now I think this is important because what happened is it's increasingly, it's increased the acceptability of certain racial rhetoric. So it used to be, right, that you had to have, dog whistles in order to be racist because you didn't want to offend some of the minorities who supported you. However, increasingly, as research has shown, racist rhetoric no longer has the same political stigma as it did. Partly as a result, and this is obviously increased in the 2016 election, the Republican Party has increasingly relies less on dog whistles and more on sort of explicit racial appeals. And polarization in political identity in the United States has created a situation in which party identity, and this was really surprising to my wife, who's from Canada, fine Halifax stock, that she was, for her, party is, today you vote for the Conservatives, tomorrow you vote for the Liberals, next day you vote for the NDP. It's just, it's something that sort of is quite fluid. Whereas for me growing up, party identity in this environment is basically equivalent to ethnic or religious identity. You watch different media, you have different cultural heroes. There's very, very little mutual interaction for reasons of this, sorting, right? So, I remember in 2004, one of my friends said, well, how could George W. Bush win? I have not met a single voter for George W. Bush. Well, it's because you're isolated. That doesn't mean that a majority of the population doesn't support him, right? And what this has done on the Republican side is it's increased the threat to American democracy. It's very important. So the Republican Party, and I do think it's the Republican Party as opposed to the Democratic Party. I can talk about that. I will talk about that. Increasingly views opposition as anti-American. So, when President Obama, the Democrat, was president, it wasn't just that he had policies people disagreed with. In fact, many of his policies were Republican-inspired, but they saw him as an enemy agent. I mean, this is how Trump, of course, rose when he questioned the fact that Obama was born in the United States. And he was viewed as anti-American. And when you view opposition as treasonous, you're getting very close to sort of an authoritarian point of view. Because fundamental to democracy is the idea that you can have legitimate political opposition. And simply opposing the government does not make you treasonous. Furthermore, the Republican Party has increasingly done something which we call sort of playing legal hardball. This is where you kind of, democracy rests on the sort of mutual understandings, not simply on sort of the letter of the Constitution, and accepts that sort of both parties will abide by long-standing democratic norms. For example, it was generally understood for a long time that impeachment would only take place for serious violations, right? As occurred with Richard Nixon, who used the FBI to kind of attack the Democratic Party. However, the Republican Party in the 1990s began to sort of stretch those limits and impeached President Bill Clinton for really, especially when we think back, compared to what Trump is doing now, relatively minor offenses, right? Having an affair with an intern, really not good, but maybe not something you want to impeach over, right? I would say really not good, kind of gross. But and even more strikingly, it has long been recognized that presidents have a right to appoint a Supreme Court justice. However, in early 2016, when a conservative Supreme Court justice died, Mitch McConnell, who is the Republican head of the Senate, simply did not allow hearings to go forward. And this was a really striking break from Democratic tradition. In other words, this was something where, it was basically effectively, consists of an effective attack on normal functioning democratic institutions. So, I think this is one way in which the Republican Party has really sort of undermined the functioning of normal democratic practice. Next, you have increasing support for anti-democratic measures. So much research there's a Yale scholar by the name of Milan Skolik. He looks at sort of degrees of partisanship and democracy. So, people, oftentimes will say that they support democracy in the abstract, but then he has, a series where you say, well, yeah, you support democracy in the abstract, but what if abiding by democratic norms means that the other side wins, and therefore people who are sort of strongly polarized tend to sort of be willing to sort of give up democracy if that will allow their side to win. And we've seen this in increasing attacks on the right to vote. Before 2006, there were very sort of weak ID requirements for voting in the United States, because they were very minimal, and the idea was to sort of encourage as broad participation as possible. However, since then, there have been 33 efforts, mostly by Republican legislatures in the states, because the states in the United States control voting, to sort of increase these ID requirements. And while these laws have mostly, not always, been written with the explicit idea of excluding supporters of the Democratic Party, that is clearly the intent. So the idea is that sort of that poor visible minorities oftentimes do not have these government IDs, and therefore that sort of inhibits their right to vote. Furthermore, this was probably taken to the extreme in Georgia in the election for the governor, where Brian Kemp, pictured here, he ran an election against Stacey Abrams, as some of you may know. At the same time, while he was running, he was Secretary of State of Georgia, which meant that he was both running the election and running in the election. I mean, this is really classic. It's almost getting Russia stuff, right? I presented this talk in Moscow, and they're like, that's like us, man. And what he did is he had something called the exact match system. So if there was any, the smallest deviation between your social security and other ID, you were thrown off the voter rolls in the run-up to the election. As a result of exact match, which he ran, 53,000 were purged from the voter rolls, 70% of those were African American, i.e. the most likely to vote Republican. Now, I don't necessarily think that this was driven by racism per se. It was clearly driven by partisan advantage, but it doesn't make it any less non-democratic. Next, you've had, in the 2016 election, in my mind, is a disturbing phenomenon whereby you have relatively moderate Republicans who I believe are genuine Democrats, people like Paul Ryan, who used to be the Speaker of the House for the Republican Party before 2018, who basically were clearly very uncomfortable with Trump's open racism and his his anti-democracy, his calls to sort of attack the press. But because of the polarization, he basically was unwilling to openly oppose Trump. And in general, there have been very few Republicans, elected Republicans, I think, if a Republican criticizes Trump, that person is retired. I'd say the one exception, I think, is right now Mitt Romney, who is the senator of Utah, who I think one of the few elected Republicans, major elected Republicans, who's willing to openly challenge Trump. So this again sort of facilitates, slide into autocracy, and it's because of the sort of degree of polarization. You also, in support for Trump in 2016, we see the role of identity and basically fear of racial threat coming into play. There's a wonderful book by John Sides that sort of is a sort of comprehensive analysis of the 2016 election. I recommend it to all of you. It's very well written, very easy to follow. And basically he shows that Trump supporters, when he measured sort of in, whether or not you dislike blacks or not, they aren't necessarily, dislike blacks more than sort of, say, other Republicans who supported other candidates in the primary. However, they do have a much stronger feelings of racial threat. In other words, they feel much more strongly that people in my group are losing jobs to the other group, and they also feel that whites are asked to make too many sacrifices to benefit another race. And this heavily predicts vote for Trump. And what's interesting in the Democratic Party is that Hillary Clinton's appeal was very much about inclusion and the like. Now this appeal worked very well for educated whites. She had actually greater support among educated whites than did Obama in 2012. However, for those less educated whites, they all basically abandoned her and flocked to Trump. And this is what they call a diploma divide within the Democratic Party, between whites who sort of are more kind of susceptible or sort of more view things in terms of racial threat and white anxiety, and those sort of more educated ones who support inclusion. And basically the issue is that there are far more of the voters on the less educated side than on the educated side, especially in swing states like Pennsylvania, where she lost white working class support. But the result of all of this has been, which I can, it sounds partisan, but it's simply true. The Republican Party, one of the two major parties in the United States, has become an authoritarian party. Think like that. What do I mean by this? I mean that they are increasingly unwilling to follow established democratic rules. You have Mitch Romney, who's not allowing Obama to select a Supreme Court justice. They increasingly treat opposition as illegitimate or anti-American. and are increasingly supporting anti-democratic measures like limiting the right to vote. And I don't think it's necessarily because Republicans are worse people or anything. Certainly the Democratic Party has its share of corruption and you name it. The issue is that the Republican base is among a demographic that perceives itself to be shrinking. And if you're shrinking, it's in your political interest to support measures to restrict the right to vote. It simply makes sense, right? It's not because you're evil. It's because that's in your political interest, which is why the Republican Party has been so active in supporting these measures to restrict the vote and why they've been so disruptive of democratic institutions. The other thing I think would come out of this is that while a lot of attention is spent on Trump, Trump is simply, in a sense, not the biggest issue in American politics. There's a very good chance he will lose, but he will still have one of the two major parties in the United States be, in my view, an authoritarian party. So what does this mean for the future of American democracy? The real issue, one level, you have a demographic decline, increase in minorities. So, in principle, many have argued you'll have a sort of emerging Democratic majority. And indeed, Republicans have only been able to gain a majority in one presidential election since 1988. In the Electoral College, because of the Electoral College, they have managed to win 2 elections while losing the popular vote. Of course, we have that here as well. The most recent election, we used to think, oh, that's so American. That's not necessarily unique to the United States, as the Conservative Party right now feels. But in any case, the Republican Party for a long time will have substantial support in southern states and throughout the country. I mean, the fact is that Trump has about 90% approval rating within the Republican Party, and despite everything, has about 40% of support in the country. So I think, this is, what I think needs to happen in the United States is you need to have the emergence of you need 2 parties. You need a normal conservative party, which is in a sense more like Canada. I think Canada provides, the Conservative Party in Canada provides a model for the United States. The question is, I think, what's interesting about Canada, I just thought, what about Canada? I'm just going to end with this. I think, one of the differences is that because of the Quebec issue, white nationalism has not been a fruitful avenue, and indeed we saw this with the failure of the sort of populist party in most recent elections. And also, I think historically, demography is not destiny. You have greater support for immigration and multiculturalism, although it's certainly not universal in Canada. So just want to thank you.